During her lunch break, sitting with Miyuki and Tomoe on a bench outside the kitchen, she couldn't help but voice the question that had been forming in her mind since the first day. "They eat meat every day?" she asked, almost as if posing a philosophical problem. "Not just here, but everywhere? America does this?" "So Akiko said," Miyuki replied, chewing her sandwich slowly, as if trying to extract maximum information from the act of eating. "She said in America, families eat meat for dinner every night, multiple times a week at minimum. She said beef is common, not a luxury. She said there are restaurants where you go and order meat and eat it, and no one thinks it is unusual." "It is madness," said Tomoe. But her tone suggested not disapproval, but awe. "How does a nation organize itself this way? How do they produce this much food and still maintain an army and still transport it across oceans to distant camps?" These questions were asked and re-asked over the following weeks as Hana and the other women gradually adjusted to their new reality. Their bodies, initially resistant to the abundance, began to adapt. The constant hunger that had been a background radiation of their lives began to fade. They began to put on weight, not dramatically, but noticeably. Their hair began to shine again. The constant cough that had plagued many of them as the result of poor nutrition began to subside. Their energy levels increased. They were, in fact, becoming healthier, and that health was itself a shock. With health came questions, and with questions came a slow, uncomfortable reassessment of everything they had been taught about the enemy. It was one thing to resist the idea of American benevolence, to assume that this food was part of some propaganda campaign or that the other shoe would eventually drop. But as weeks turned into months, and the pattern never deviated, it became harder to maintain that narrative. The food came day after day in the same abundance. The portion sizes never decreased. The variety never diminished. The treatment remained scrupulously fair and regulated. No special treatment for cooperation, no starvation for minor infractions. Just consistent, reliable, systematic feeding. One evening, Hana found herself working in the kitchen with an American cook named Robert, a middle-aged man from Nebraska who spoke no Japanese, but who communicated through gestures and a few simple English words that had become familiar. He was preparing the next day's supplies, organizing the refrigerators and checking inventory. He noticed Hana watching him arrange steaks in a tray, each one substantial enough to feed 2 people. "Good meat," he said, pointing to the steaks and then to her, then giving a thumbs up. He said something in English slowly. "You eat good here. You get strong." He flexed his arm, which was indeed muscular, and smiled. It was not a smile designed to seduce or manipulate. It was the smile of someone who took genuine satisfaction in feeding people, in providing nutrition. He had no romantic interest in Hana and made no attempt at familiarity. He was simply, in his way, proud of his work. After he moved to another task, Hana found herself thinking about what this represented. This American, probably a farmer or rancher before the war, was taking care to prepare good food for enemy prisoners. It was his job, yes, but there was something in his demeanor that suggested it was more than that. He believed in feeding people well. It was a thing he valued. And somehow, this made her reassess her understanding of what it meant to be an enemy. Were not most enemies, when you encountered them without the filter of ideology and propaganda, simply people doing their jobs? The turning point in her mental landscape came during the 2nd month of captivity. A new group of Japanese prisoners had arrived, women captured from a different location, women who had not eaten a full meal in even longer than Hana's cohort had. Hana and the other original prisoners were assigned to help them integrate into the camp routine. She was given the job of showing one of the new arrivals, a woman named Chiyo who was dangerously thin and whose eyes held the sharp focus of deep hunger around the compound. When Chiyo entered the mess hall for her first meal, she stopped. She actually stopped in the middle of the room and began to shake. Hana recognized the signs of shock. Without thinking, she reached out and steadied the woman, guiding her through the line. She pointed to each item as it was served, repeating softly in Japanese, "Meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread, milk." She explained the dining procedures, the fact that everything on your tray must be consumed, the expectation that you would eat dessert. Chiyo took the food with hands that trembled. During the meal, Chiyo ate slowly at first, then with increasing desperation. She wept while she chewed. She looked at Hana with an expression that was difficult to read, gratitude mixed with confusion, mixed with a kind of grief for all the time she had spent hungry. When she had finished her main course, Corporal Keiko brought the dessert cart around. "Apple pie today," she said. "You want?" Chio nodded numbly. When the pie was placed in front of her, she stared at it for a long moment before beginning to eat it, tears running freely down her face. Hana sat beside her, not speaking, understanding that there were no adequate words for this moment. It was the moment when the body's survival instinct overrode ideological training, when the simple fact of food made impossible things possible. That night, in the barracks, Chio asked the question that everyone had been thinking, but few had dared to voice aloud. "Is this real?" she asked. "Or are we going to wake up and discover that this has been a hallucination brought on by hunger?" "It is real," Hana said. "I have been here 2 months now. It does not change. Every day, the same abundance. Every day, they feed us this way." "Why?" Chio's voice was almost anguished. "Why would they do this? We are the enemy. Our nation did things to American soldiers. Why do they respond to this with beef?" It was Tomo who answered, her voice quiet and thoughtful. "Because," she said, "they can. Because they have enough. Because their rules say they must. I do not think they are being kind. I think they are being systematic. But the result is the same. We eat. We survive. Our bodies become strong." As the months passed, a strange internal shift began to occur in the minds of the imprisoned women. The initial shock gave way to something more complex. On one level, they came to rely on the food, to plan their days around mealtimes in a way that would have been unthinkable in the chaotic hunger of the war's final stages. The knowledge that breakfast would come at 6:30, that it would include eggs and bacon and bread and butter, became something to depend on. The knowledge that dinner would include meat, fresh vegetables, milk, and dessert became a kind of security. But on another level, there was a growing discomfort with the cognitive dissonance of their situation. They were prisoners of war. They had been taught that this status meant deprivation, that captivity was meant to be a punishment, a reduction in circumstances commensurate with capture. Instead, they were living better than they had lived in years. They had access to electricity, to running water, to medical care, to food that was not just sufficient, but abundant. How could one reconcile this with the narrative of being an enemy? Some of the women began to keep journals, as Hana did, documenting their meals and their thoughts. Miyuki noted the irony of eating well while knowing that Japan itself was experiencing famine. She wrote, "The Americans eat meat daily and give meat daily to prisoners. At home, my family has not seen real meat in 3 years. My mother writes of catching insects to supplement their protein. Here, I am fed better than any officer in Tokyo." The guilt was palpable. To be thriving in this place felt in some way like a betrayal of those left behind. Hana's journal took a different turn. She found herself writing not about guilt, but about revelation. She documented each meal, each new combination of foods, each new dish that was introduced. When they were served ice cream for the first time, real ice cream, cold and sweet and made from cream rather than from some poor substitute, she devoted an entire page to the experience. She described the color, the texture, the way it melted on her tongue. She wrote, "If food is a language, then American food speaks of abundance so fundamental it is not even conscious. They do not fear scarcity. They do not ration hope. They feed because it is their nature to feed." By the 3rd month, the women had begun to acclimate not just physically but psychologically. They were no longer stunned by the meals. They began to have preferences. Some favored the beef dishes, others preferred chicken. Hana found herself particularly fond of a dish involving fish with butter and lemon. Tomoe developed a taste for the American apple pie that appeared at least once a week. Miyuki would smile when certain desserts were served, a chocolate cake that clearly came from a mix but which was nonetheless competent and welcomed. They began to understand the rhythms of American food culture, at least as it was represented in the mess hall. They learned that Friday meant fresh fish, that Sunday was often turkey or special roasted chicken, that desserts varied by season, fruit pies in summer, puddings in winter, ice cream year-round but with particular favor in warm months. They learned that the cooks rotated in who prepared meals, and that some were better than others, though all were competent and generous with portions. More significantly, they began to understand what this all meant. The abundance of food was not a mystery or a propaganda campaign. It was a straightforward result of an economic and agricultural system designed to produce surplus rather than scarcity. It was the default state of an industrial nation that had built its infrastructure around assuming enough, not rationing, not fear of running out. For women raised in a completely different system, one built on the assumption that there was never quite enough, this was almost impossibly alien. One morning, as Hana was helping in the kitchen, she found herself in conversation with Robert, the American cook, facilitated by Akiko, who was working in the administrative office that day. Hana asked through the interpreter how much meat the camp used in a week. Robert seemed confused by the question at first, as if the scale of supply was so normal to him that it had never occurred to him to quantify it. He did some rough calculations on a piece of paper, muttering to himself in English, then wrote out a number. They went through 28 beefsteaks per day for the prisoner kitchen alone. That was not counting the officers' dining room, the enlisted men's mess, or the various other food service locations around the camp. Every day? Hana asked through Akiko, almost unable to believe the translation. 28 steaks every single day. Robert nodded. Actually, might be more, he said slowly, aware that Akiko was translating. We go through more when the truck comes. I can send more fresh. I got capacity. And this is normal? Hana pressed. For America, this is normal? Robert seemed to struggle with the concept of the question. For him, it clearly was just normal. This was how much food you went through when you were feeding a prison camp. It was logistics, supply chains, standardized meal plans. He couldn't imagine anyone questioning it. Akiko translated his response. He says yes, it is normal. He says America produces this much food all the time. He says there are places that produce more meat than this. He says it would be unusual if there was not this much meat. After that conversation, something shifted for Hana. She had been thinking about the food in terms of its impact on her, its effect on her body and mind. But Robert's matter-of-factness about the quantity had reframed it entirely. This was not a choice being made specifically for the prisoners. This was simply how American food production and distribution worked at the scale of industrial feeding. The fact that prisoners received meat daily was not a special act of benevolence. It was a byproduct of a system where meat production was so abundant that even prisoners could be fed according to the same standard as soldiers. She shared this realization with the other women that evening in the barracks. Tomoe had been thinking about it from a different angle. If this is normal, she said, then we must reconsider what normal is. What does it mean for a nation to consider this normal? What does it say about their resources, their organization, their priorities? It says they will not lose the war, said Miyuki flatly. It says they have the production capacity, the logistical capability, the resources to do this on a massive scale while simultaneously maintaining a global military effort. It says they are not frightened of running out, and that is terrifying because it means Japan cannot win. The conversation fell silent. The conclusion was not surprising. They had known for a while that the war was lost, but stating it directly, acknowledging it in relation to something as mundane as beefsteaks, made it real in a way that other discussions had not. As autumn turned to winter, Hana documented a new realization in her journal. The food, she wrote, was more than just food. It was a kind of communication. It was a message about what American society valued, what it prioritized, how it allocated its vast resources. In Japan, food was treated as a precious commodity, rationed and controlled and distributed according to hierarchy and need. Here, food seemed to be treated as something almost casual, something so abundant it could be given freely, even to prisoners. This realization came with an uncomfortable additional thought. If American society could be so abundant with something as basic as food, what else might be abundant? What other resources, other capabilities, other advantages might they be taking for granted because they lived in a country with surplus rather than scarcity? It was not a comfortable thought. It led to other thoughts, about the war itself, about why Japan had ultimately decided it could not win, about what kinds of societies could and could not sustain global conflict. The other women were having similar realizations, though not all were ready to articulate them. Some resistance remained, a kind of stubborn refusal to acknowledge too clearly what the food was telling them about the vast gulf between American and Japanese industrial capacity. But as the winter deepened and they settled further into the rhythms of camp life, even that resistance began to erode. By the 4th month of captivity, Hana had gained a significant amount of weight. Not in a way that made her unrecognizable, but enough to restore the physical signs of health. Her cheeks had filled out, her skin had cleared. The persistent cough was gone. She had energy and the ability to work without exhaustion that came from regular nutrition. She was, objectively, healthier than she had been in years. And with that, health came a strange new problem. Guilt. Not guilt about being treated well. That guilt was there, certainly, particularly in relation to the Japanese civilians and soldiers still suffering at home. But a different kind of guilt. A guilt about adapting, about coming to take comfort in the patterns of the camp, about beginning to anticipate mealtimes with something that felt dangerously close to pleasure. She was sitting in the barracks one evening, trying to write a letter to her family, which would be censored before being sent, when Tomo sat down beside her. The older woman had also changed visibly in her months of captivity. She looked like someone who had just recovered from a long illness, still thin but no longer gaunt, her eyes clear and sharp. "You are struggling," Tomo observed. It was not a question. "I should not be comfortable here," Hana said. "I should be resisting. I should be filled with anger at the enemy, with determination to endure captivity as a test of my character. Instead, I am grateful for the meat at dinner." Tomoe sat quietly for a moment. "In Buddhism," she said, "there is a concept of accepting reality as it is, not as we believe it should be. You are here. You are alive. You are fed. These are facts. To reject them because they do not fit the narrative of how captivity should be is to reject reality in favor of fantasy. This is not wisdom. This is suffering caused by attachment to what should be rather than acceptance of what is. But to be grateful to the enemy, to be grateful for food is not political," Tomo interrupted gently. "It is human. These Americans feed us. Whether they do so out of adherence to the Geneva Convention or out of the sheer excess of their agricultural system does not matter. The result is that we eat. We survive. We become stronger. And perhaps, if we must be captured, if we must be prisoners, it is not the worst thing that this capture includes regular meals and adequate care.